Hello, I'm Mike Vinsel. Today we're continuing to read the illustrated story of Stephen Stroh by Michael D. Vinsel. And that's me, story and illustrations by me. Okay, so today we're on page 245, chapter 10, the beginning of chapter 10, Day of the Harvest Party. So here we go. Friday, October 29th was the last day of harvest. Frost clung to the grass until lunchtime, when Anton's crew finished picking their block. For Stephen, it had been a magical day. Sunlight refracted in the frost, making the gauzy wood smoke glow with sparkling flecks of rainbow colors. The work of the season was done. The Jamaicans held their hands close to the glowing coals. Full bins waited in rows of 6 for Jessie. Towards the end of the harvest, there had sometimes been half work days because the big blocks had already been picked. The last blocks were small and took one picking crew only half a day to pick. This day, Ted Castro arrived in his pickup truck and asked Stephen if he would come with him to a farm to pick up 2 goats. Mackie would drive the Ford 2000 back to the packing house. Mr. Castro had arranged to buy the goats for the Jamaicans to make goat curry and soup for the harvest party. Stephen was happy to go. He was eager to learn about how they would make the curry and soup. Brock and Anton had told Stephen about it. Nothing is wasted. They'd said, nothing is wasted, they'd said. Nothing. Everything goes into the soup, except most of the fur. The farm where they picked up the goats was in Leesboro, near the block where Stephen had had the accident when they'd been pulling out the Puritans. Stephen remembered the goats in the orchard that day. He remembered talking to them while he drank coffee, sitting in the doorway of the van. Those goats must have had escaped from this same farm, Stephen figured. When he and Ted Castro arrived, they stopped the truck, got out, and walked to the farmhouse. A man walked out to greet them as the wood-framed screen door slapped shut from its spring. Samuel Herrick, this is Stephen Stroh. Stephen Stroh, this is Samuel Herrick, Ted Castro said. Stephen shook hands with Mr. Herrick. Nice to meet you, he said. Likewise, Mr. Herrick said. Let me show you the rams. I think you'll find them satisfactory. Ted Castro chatted with Mr. Herrick as they walked. They obviously had known each other for a long time. Inside the barn, they came to a stall where the 2 goats were waiting. Each goat had a length of rope tied around its neck as a collar. The ropes were tied to an iron ring bolted to the framing of the stall. Mr. Herrick untied the ropes and handed them to Stephen. Stephen had never handled goats before, but he didn't say anything about that. He wrapped the ropes around his hand to have a good grip in case they tried to get away. Stephen found that it was easy to handle them. They were friendly and didn't try to break free. They all walked back to the truck, where Mr. Castro and Mr. Herrick talked for a few minutes. Then Ted Castro paid Mr. Herrick. Ted Castro walked to the rear of the pickup truck and opened the tailgate. I hope you'll be so accommodating as to sit in the back and make sure the goats don't jump out, Ted Castro said to Stephen. It'll be a distinct pleasure to ride with such a distinguished company, Stephen said. Ted Castro chuckled and got in the truck. He backed out to the road and drove. Stephen sat facing backward on 2 bags of cement that were stacked at the head of the pickup truck bed. The 2 goats stood facing him, their shiny dark horns contrasting with the almost white fur. The goats were clean, They looked at as if Mr. Herrick had combed them before Stephen and Ted Castro had arrived. They had long beards and faces like old men. Their eyes were very strange to Stephen. The irises were light blue-gray, and the pupils were horizontal rectangles. How would the world appear through such eyes? Maybe been seen, maybe been seen before through other eyes on other days while going home. Stephen sang the Grateful Dead lyric to the goats. He noticed that the goats were indeed as sure-footed as goats were reputed to be. Their bodies swayed as one with the curves, then together swayed back upright when the road straightened. They seemed to be expecting something from Stephen, he thought. They seemed very friendly, just standing in the pickup bed looking at Stephen, swaying with the turns along the drive. Then one came towards Stephen, head bowed and curled over in a gesture that Stephen read as seeking to convey affection. The other goat did the same. Stephen tried to be accommodating, to use Ted Castro's word, but he found that any reciprocated friendliness escalated the affection of the goats. Stephen did not know how to de-escalate the gestures of affection. He finally grasped the rope collars and physically held the goats at arm's length. Stephen studied their faces. Had these goats been there that day of the accident? They might have been. There had been several goats of the same color there that day. He wondered, were they so friendly out of familiarity? Did they remember him? Stephen didn't know the answer. He believed that other people also probably wouldn't know, although they might profess to know. Stephen knew these were thoughts he should keep to himself. He also was aware that he knew the fate of the goats. He knew that he was taking them to be killed for the festivities of the harvest party. Could that be construed to be going home? He muttered to the goats, singing the last two words. As much as Stephen liked the goats, he knew that he was at the age where he had to behave as a man. He knew he wasn't a man. He told himself that he didn't know what that word meant either. But he knew that he had to accept that these goats had to go to their fate, to become curry and soup. He had to harden his feelings and ignore their pleas for mercy, if that was what the goats were trying to communicate. He resolved to make himself believe that the right thing to do was to facilitate the festivities of the harvest party. He knew that sacrificing animals for a feast was perhaps the most time-honored tradition of humanity. He knew that he should feel this kind of dilemma every time he ate meat, if he was to be an honest person. He thought about Tracy Bass and what it would be like to be a vegetarian. Well, he told the goats, I'm going to facilitate the festivities for the Jamaicans. They arrived at the packing house and drove up past the bunkhouses to the area behind the big garage. Ted Castro stopped the truck, got out, and opened the tailgate. Stephen stood up in the bed of the truck, holding the rope leashes of the goats. He led them over to the edge and ushered them out of the truck onto the pavement. Stephen stepped down after the goats and led them over to Mackie, who greeted Stephen and the two goats. Ah, Stephen Mon, you delivered the goats. Indeed, they are fine, he said, as he crouched down and inspected the two animals. Mackie took the ropes and led the goats to a small pen that had been made to keep the goats overnight until the day of the harvest party. Stevie Mon, can you come here in the morning to help prepare for the feast? Mackie asked. Yes, I'd be happy to. What time should I be here? Stephen asked. Not so early, Mon. About 11 o'clock, Mackie said. I'll be here. Okay, see you then. See you then, Stephen said. No, I'll be there. I'll be here. Okay, see you then, Stephen said. Stephen rode his bicycle home. Harvest was over. He thought to himself as he rode down the big hill, down old New Dartford Road, toward his parents' house. Tomorrow would be the great harvest party he had heard about and looked forward to all year. Just a second, I'm going to get a sip of water. Okay, that's right. Okay, tomorrow would be the great harvest party he had heard about and looked forward to all year. He would ask Tracy if she would go with him. Then it occurred to him, as he rode across the shadows of the leafless trees, what kind of idiot invites a vegetarian to a party where they're going to kill goats? He knew that the whole party would be a festival of meat and beer. She neither ate meat nor drank beer. He wished it didn't have to be that way. If it were something else, he would ask her to go. But not the harvest party, with goat curry and soup, he thought to himself. As he continued his ride, his mind had not settled the question of whether or not to ask Tracy to the party. He considered the reasons why he had felt that he should not ask her, and realized that it was because he was afraid. He had made up excuses. He was afraid of what his friends would say, not of Tracy's reactions to the goat soup and curry. He could simply warn her that most of the food would be meat and everybody would be drinking beer, and she could decide if that was something she would like to go to or not. Of course, she would have to ask her mother. He decided to call her when he got home. Stephen noticed that it was no longer difficult to climb up Filbert Hill on his bicycle. He was proud that he had become stronger. He crested the hill and coasted into the driveway of his parents' house, parked his bicycle, and ran up the back porch stairs. Mrs. Stroh was up. She'd made baked chicken with sauce made from Campbell's cream of mushroom soup. She'd just taken it from the oven. Stephen went into the kitchen. Hi, Mom. Ooh, that looks good. He snuck a taste of the sauce. You're home early. Everything okay? She said. Well, the harvest is officially over. Tomorrow is the big party. And then sometime next week the Jamaicans will leave, Stephen said. Will they go back to Jamaica? She asked. A few will, but most of them will go down to Florida to cut sugar cane. When that's done, in January, they'll go to Jamaica. Then in spring, they'll start the whole thing over. Some cutting sugar again in Jamaica, some in Louisiana, and some going to Kentucky to pick tobacco. And eventually, back up to New Hampshire for the apple harvest again. He said, Sounds like a tough life. Not much time with their families, huh? She said. Hardly any time at all. It certainly is a tough life, Stephen said. Stephen changed the subject. Mom, there's a girl I knew in school I saw a few weeks ago walking up Leesboro Road. I gave her a ride on the tractor down to the packing house. To tell the truth, I've liked her for a long time. I was thinking I'd like to ask her to the harvest party tomorrow. You think I should call her? He asked. Well, if you want her to go, you'd better call her soon, Mrs. Stroh said. No, I mean, it's a harvest party with the Jamaicans, and there will be beer and everything. And she's still in high school, and oh yeah, she's a vegetarian, and the food is going to be goat curry and soup. I mean, is that something a guy should ask a girl to? Stephen asked. Are you worried she might be prejudiced? Mrs. Stroh asked. No, I'm sure she's not. She had dinner with us at the bunkhouse that night. Just beans and rice. That's not it, he said. Okay, so what's the problem? Mrs. Stroh asked. Today we got 2 live goats for the party. The Jamaicans are going to slaughter them for the curry and soup. Don't you think that would gross her out? Yeah, he asked. Mrs. Stroh thought for a while. If she's the right girl for you, You should ask her to go. The only way to find out if she's the right girl is to ask her to go. If she doesn't want to go, she's probably not the right girl for you. But if she does, well, Mrs. Stroh said. Thanks, Mom. I'm going to use the downstairs phone, Stephen said. Stephen went downstairs to use the phone in the basement. Hello, Mrs. Bass said. Hello, this is Stephen Stroh. Is Tracy there? Yes, just a second. Stephen could hear her calling Tracy, and then some mumbling, probably muffled by Mrs. Bass's hand over the receiver. Hello, Stephen? Hi, Tracy, he replied. I was wondering, tomorrow at the orchard we're having a harvest party for the Jamaicans, and I was hoping you might like to go with me. That sounds very interesting. Yes, I'd love to. Thank you. Stephen was thrilled. She said yes. He did not have to warn her about the food, except he felt he'd better tell her about the goats. Oh, that's great. Oh, one thing you should know. They're going to make goat curry and this goat soup that everybody talks about. I went to the farm today to pick up the 2 goats with Ted Castro. I mean, they're alive, and tomorrow they're going to kill them. I know you're a vegetarian, so if that kind of thing grosses you out, I understand. There should be peas and rice anyway, he said. Oh, don't worry about that. There will be apples too, right? She said. Yes, there will indeed be, he said. Then, of course, there's the matter of getting there. I'm riding my bike to the orchard at 11. At 11 tomorrow morning to help Mackie kill the goats. I kind of want to see how that's done. So how about after that, I ride my bike back to your house, say at 4 o'clock, and we can ride bicycles together to the party, he asked. Wow, killing goats. I've never seen anything like that either. Instead, why don't you stop by my house on the way, and we can ride to the orchard together in the morning, Tracy asked. That would be great. I'll see you at about 10:30, Stephen said. He was delighted. Okay, see you then, Tracy said. Okay, bye, Stephen said. Okay, bye, she said. Stephen got up on Saturday morning, looked out the basement window to the frost-covered backyard. The sun, already high, shined through leafless woods. He'd slept until after sunrise. First time in a long time, he said to himself. He went up to the kitchen. Mr. Stroh sat warming his hands on his coffee cup while reading the New Dartford Bureau. Mrs. Stroh stood at the counter, studying an issue of Gourmet magazine. She was going to make omelette soufflés. Stephen hadn't seen his parents in the morning since before the harvest. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad, he said. He poured himself a cup of coffee. So, what's on the docket for today? Your mother says you've got quite a day ahead of you, Mr. Stroh said. Oh, yes, big day, Stephen answered. Tonight is the harvest party for the Jamaicans. Yesterday I went with Ted Castro to pick up 2 goats. The Jamaicans are going to kill them to make goat curry. They also make this soup from it with the leftover entrails. D'offal, the Jamaicans call it. I'm going to help them, Stephen said. That sounds truly awful, Stephen's father said, joking. Sounds very interesting, Mrs. Stroh said. You know, when we lived in Cuba, we had a Jamaican maid named Bernice. Do you remember me telling about her? She was wonderful. She was the greatest cook, and she spoke in this wonderful accent. Do the Jamaicans at the orchard speak in that accent? She asked. Yes, they do. I really like this guy, Mackie. He's always so cheerful. He's a big, strong guy, probably very tough, but he's the most congenial and polite person I've ever met, Stephen said. That's right. I remember how polite Bernice was. Are they all that way? Mrs. Stroh asked. Well, he thought about it. No, they are not all as polite as Mackie. There is a group of older guys, Mackie, this guy Stedman Johnson, a guy named Altamont Powell, Neville Jarrett. Those guys are all over 60. Altamont Powell is 72. Stedman Johnson is a Protestant minister. They call him Preacher Johnson. Those guys are really nice. Some of the younger guys are not so cheerful. Can't say I blame them, Stephen said. I suppose it's understandable. I can imagine it must be pretty rough work being so far from home, Mrs. Stroh replied. Stephen told the story of when Clive Edmonds had asked Stephen why he worked when he didn't have to, that Clive had been under the impression that in America the government just gives people money and life is easy. Stephen added that some of the guys had said they had never been to school in their lives. Mr. Stroh looked up from the newspaper, then folded the paper and set it down, focusing his attention on the conversation between Stephen and Mrs. Stroh. You know, I think it is really wonderful that you've taken this job at the orchard, Stephen. You might not know it now, but this experience of meeting and working with people from all walks of life, well, it's valuable, and it will pay big dividends in the future. Mark my word. Thanks, Dad, Stephen replied. I know most people around here look down on that kind of work, but the way I see it, getting to know all the people I've met working at the orchard is valuable in itself. If it pays dividends in the future, all the better. But even if it doesn't, I'll be happy just to have known the people, even the weird ones like Jessie. Jessie? Mrs. Stroh inquired. Oh. Stephen looked out the window to compose his thoughts on how to explain Jessie. He began, well, this guy they call Jesse, not his real name. They call him that because a few years ago, when he was 18 or 19, he robbed a convenience store in Connecticut. He robbed a store? Gasped Mr. Stroh. Yes, he did. He told us he'd held a cigarette lighter in his jacket pocket, acting like he had a gun. But he told us that he just meant it as a joke. He didn't think the clerk would take him seriously. But the clerk did take him seriously and opened the cash register and gave Jesse all the money. I guess seeing all that money was too much temptation for the moron, and Jesse grabbed it and ran out to his dirt bike. He told us that he made it all the way to Walpole, New Hampshire, and then he ran out of gas and was arrested. A period of silence followed this story. Did he go to jail? Mrs. Stroh asked. Stephen told her that Jesse had said he'd done a year in jail in Connecticut 4 or 5 years ago. He detected the concern in his parents. If you're worried that Jesse will be a bad influence on me, you don't need to be. Jesse himself is quite aware of his stupidity. He knows he is lucky that the orchard hired him. And stupid or not, he is a pretty good binmaster driver. Stephen decided not to tell them that Greg Edison had also been to jail. Stephen swallowed the last of his coffee. Well, I gotta get going. I'm gonna stop at Tracy Bass's house to ride with her to the orchard. She said she wants to go to the harvest party. She even said she wants to see how they kill the goats and cut up the meat. Funny thing for a vegetarian. I don't know how late I'll be tonight, so don't wait up. Don't drink too much, said Mrs. Stroh. Don't worry, I can't get too out of hand. Tracy doesn't drink at all. But the harvest is over, so we've got to have a party. If we didn't do that, what kind of life would that be for the Jamaicans? Stephen said. That's a good point, said Mr. Stroh. Stephen couldn't resist to add, you know, I kissed Tracy that night in September. Anyway, I gotta go. Mr. and Mrs. Stroh watched as the son they had worried about so much left the room, having shown them he was growing up. They said nothing. Mrs. Stroh thought to herself that it was true. Stephen was growing up. Tears welled in her eyes. Mr. Stroh thought to himself that Stephen was finally growing up. Stephen's need to brag about the kiss, and to his parents, revealing that it must have been his first. He was going to say, high time, but thought better of it. Stephen rode his bicycle on this beautiful late fall morning to Tracy's house. Stephen and his friends eschewed the extra weight of kickstands on their bicycles. He laid his bicycle down on the driveway, walked up, and rang the doorbell. Mrs. Bass came to the door. Tracy ran down the stairs to preempt what she thought might be an uncomfortable situation for Stephen. "Do you have time for a cup of coffee?" Mrs. Bass asked. "And an interrogation?" Tracy added. "Yes, to both," Stephen said. Stephen and Tracy sat at the table while Mrs. Bass poured coffee. "Tracy tells me you're friends with the mom boy, Peter," Mrs. Bass said. "Yes, Pete and I first met in second grade," in second grade, Stephen said. "So you graduated last year with Peter?" she asked. "Well, to tell the truth, I was supposed to graduate, but I was short one credit, so I had to go back to do an extra semester. I told her, knowing it would not he told her, not knowing it would not raise his standing in her eyes. "I see," she said. She actually appreciated that he was honest enough to admit that. "So today you kids are going to a harvest party at Rock Mountain Orchards, and they're going to slaughter goats?" "That's right. I guess it's a Jamaican tradition they do. I've never seen that before. And the guy who's doing it, going to butcher the goats, Beresford McPherson, he asked me to help," Stephen said. "I've never seen anything like that either. It does sound interesting," said Mrs. Bass. Tracy was tempted to comment that her mother would indeed find that to be interesting, being generally a fan of blood sport, but she held back. "Well, if we're going to be there by 11, we'd better guzzle up," she said. Stephen drank up his coffee, thanked Mrs. Bass, and he and Tracy left on their bicycles. Stephen and Tracy had grown up riding their bicycles with their own friends, but this was the first time they had ridden with someone of the opposite sex on a date. They were both silently self-conscious. The silence grew conspicuous. Stephen knew he had to say something. "Thanks for coming today," he said. "Of course I'd come," she said. "Well, I know you're a vegetarian and they're going to kill the goats. It would be reasonable to expect you might be grossed out by that," he said, downshifting to climb a hill. "I'm not squeamish about animals being killed for meat. I presume these goats were raised on a local farm, right?" Tracy said. "Yes, they were raised by Samuel Herrick in Leesboro," Stephen said. "I think that's fine. My objection is to factory farming, the way meat you get at supermarkets is grown. That's really bad. Do you know anything about that?" she asked. "Not really." "Well, let's take the example of beef. Beef cows these days aren't roaming the verdant hillsides eating grass. They're crowded into huge feedlots in Nebraska and Kansas and places like that. They're fed corn. Cows aren't meant to eat corn. They're meant to eat grass, like buffalo," she said. "I see. Yes, that would make sense, wouldn't it?" Stephen said. "Anyway, the government subsidizes corn, making beef artificially cheap. Farmers are paid to overproduce corn. Most of that corn goes to feed meat animals. It's all wicked bad for the environment, and who knows what hormones and antibiotics they pump them up with. The whole thing is totally artificial. That's why I'm a vegetarian," Tracy said. "I have heard a little about that," Stephen said. Factory farmed meat is the problem, not homegrown meat," Tracy said. The conversation became more comfortable as they rode. Stephen was able to tell about killing the chickens in the summer, and that led to the subject of composting and the possibilities of putting the heat it generates to some use, about which they were both in agreement. They reached the orchard, leaned their bicycles against the side of the packing house, and walked up behind the main building. Pixley Wilson and Neville Jarrett walked with them up to where the goats were. Mackie emerged from the bunkhouse kitchen with his great grin and his toothpick, his hands unconsciously honing the blade of a great crude knife whose wooden handle looked to have been handmade. The blade itself worn round from decades of habitual sharpening. It was the same knife he'd used to cut off the head of the snapping turtle. "Ah, Stevie mon, today we killed the goat," Mackie said. He turned to greet Tracy. "And the wonderful Tracy, it is a blessing on the day to have you join us. We kill the goats in just a little while. First, we must catch a fire," Mackie said. The three of them walked to see the two goats, which were tethered to a steel post of a clothesline on the edge of the orchard. The goats strained against their ropes to get at the grass that was just out of reach. The grass closer to the post, just as green and fresh, had not been grazed at all. It seemed to Stephen and Tracy that the goats only wanted the grass that was out of reach. It seemed that because they were restrained by the rope, they had an automatic instinct to pull against it, to have whatever it was that the rope kept them from. Only what was kept from only what was kept from them by the rope was important. The grass, all the sweeter for being forbidden, Tracy said. It's true for every living creature under the. It's true for, it is true for every living creature under the sun, Mackie said. "I'll bet the grass at their feet is just as good," Stephen said. He hoped that had not sounded silly to Tracy. While they watched the goats, Pixley Wilson arrived, driving the Ford 2000 with the flatbed trailer loaded with firewood. Stephen helped a group of Jamaicans unload the wood. Wilson Beauville arranged the wood to build the fire. The site was on the edge of the orchard, just off the pavement, far enough from the apple trees not to damage them. Stephen could see that fires had been built on that spot in that place before. He realized that this is where they had always built the fire, every year. Beauville set the first stick on flat ground. Against it he leaned many pencil-thin sticks, dry, brittle applewood sticks, broken by his sinewy hands into lengths of 5 or 6 inches. Successively larger sticks were placed over those, arranged to encourage airflow. Atop those, even bigger pieces, then logs, until the heap had attained a height of about 3 feet and a diameter of about 6 feet. Stephen studied the artful arrangement of the wood. He saw that Mr. Beauville had left a tunnel on one side that led to the center, where the smallest, most easily ignited sticks were. To Stephen, the pile resembled a miniature beaver lodge, minus the mud chinking. Altamont Powell came to see how progress on the fire was coming. He saw Stephen studying the unlit fire. Stevie, my friend, do you know why the pile is structured as carefully as you see that it is?" Mr. Powell asked. "No, I don't," Stephen said. Powell smiled. "It is because to catch this fire, no petrol must be used. This fire we start with 1 sulfur matchstick. It is old Jamaican style. The fire is the spirit of the festival," he said. "I see," said Stephen. "I was wondering about that. Did you see that Tracy is here?" "She came here with me," Stephen said. "Ah, Stevie boy, I warned you once before. You must not be deceived by the fast American woman. You come to Jamaica, marry my granddaughter, live happy ever after," said Mr. Powell. Some seconds went by, then Altamont Powell led on. "Don't worry, Mon, I pull your leg. Tracy is, I'm sure, a fine woman. We must go see her." Stephen and Altamont Powell walked over to Tracy. She was playing with the goats, just as they were when riding in the back of the truck with Stephen. Now the goats were very much in love with Tracy. She was laughing while they attempted to shake hands with her, as dogs do. their heads bobbing up and down. Stephen imagined that she must be thinking how terrible it was that these goats were so friendly, so trusting, and she herself was about to take part in a party where they were to be killed and eaten. Then he realized that those were his thoughts, not Tracy's. Perhaps she had already reconciled that with herself, he thought. Altamont Powell, this is Tracy Bass. He was sleeping the time you were here before. Tracy, this is Altamont Powell, Stephen said. It is an honor to meet you, Miss Tracy. I should not speak a word of de grapevine. And I should not swear. It is an honor to meet you, Miss Tracy. I should not speak word of de grapevine, but I was told of the wonderful lady Stephen had brought to the orchard, Mr. Powell said. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Powell. Stephen speaks highly of you. He admires you very much. What's this? He speaks highly? Stephen, mon, I once tell you you must not smoke de ganja. You must speak soberly, Mr. Powell said, stern-faced. Then he grinned. I joke. I am blessed to bask in the goodwill of such a man as Stephen Stroh. I admire him too. Anyway, let us go see the catching of the fire. It is important to see, said Powell. The other Jamaicans had come up from the bunkhouses. Pixley Wilson and the wood gathering crew had brought enough logs to keep the fire burning into the night. It was just past noon, a clear late autumn day. A cool, crisp breeze gently rattled the few dry leaves that remained on the gnarled apple trees. Frost would arrive as soon as the sun set. Stephen knew. He and Tracy observed solemnly with Mr. Powell as Wilson Beauville tore a strip from a brown paper shopping bag. This he wrinkled between his palms and rolled into a cone-shaped tube. Pixley Wilson took a single wooden strike-anywhere match from a box and handed it to Beauville. Mr. Beauville crouched to give shelter to the match, waiting for a lull in the breeze, waiting for the time to strike the match. All the Jamaicans had gathered around, forming a ring that would protect the flame. Stephen and Tracy watched, both feeling lucky to be admitted to such an event as this. They both knew this was just the beginning. The moment arrived. Beauville held the brown paper cone close to the tip of the match. He struck the match with his thumbnail. The tiny flame survived in the shelter of his cupped hand. While the group watched, he introduced the tiny flame to the brown paper, and the flame grew. He moved the burning paper in accordance with the climbing nature of flame. Soon the flame was strong, groping up the shaft of paper toward Beauville's hand. He moved it carefully into the tunnel, into the heart of the pile. The flame found its home and grew. Beauville withdrew his arm from the stack, backed away, and stood, watching with the others as tiny wisps of flame worked their way, crackling through the lattice work of sticks to the larger wood, gaining strength. Then the tiny flames disappeared behind white smoke. Beauville knelt down again and blew into the tunnel. The smoke disappeared and bright flames grew through the pile again. The flames grew strong and rose to the top of the pile. The task at this point changed from one of coaxing life into the frail fire to managing its power. Beauville's job of catching the fire was done. Stephen liked that the Jamaicans used the word catch instead of start regarding the fire. The rest of the assembled men took over the work of maintaining the fire. Ted and Doreen Castro arrived. They were dressed formally, as if they were going to church. Ted wore a gray suit, white shirt, shiny black shoes, and a green, yellow, and black tie, the colors of the Jamaican flag. Doreen wore a pale yellow dress with brown shoes. Stephen looked at the clothes of the Jamaicans. Preacher Johnson wore a blue suit, white shirt with a gray patterned tie. The Jamaicans who'd been on Stephen's crew had all kept the long tail feathers of the pheasants the hunters had given Stephen, in this day wore them in the brim bands of their hats. Stephen stood beside Tracy. Everybody watched the fire. Larger pieces of wood were added, and a bed of coals began to glow red beneath the flames. Stephen knew that the next thing to do was to slaughter the goats. "Stevie Mon," Mackie called. Stephen turned to Tracy. "I have to go help Mackie kill the goats. If you don't want to see something like that, I understand," he said. "I know what to expect. I'll watch," she said. Stephen had prepared pieces of torn flannel cloth. Mackie had prepared pieces of torn flannel cloth that, when twisted, would act as rope. There was plenty of actual rope available at the orchard. Stephen surmised that twisted cloth would be less painful on the ankles of the goats. He led the first goat to an overhanging branch of an apple tree closest to the fire. This tree had obviously been pruned over the years for just this purpose, as it had a stout branch jutting level from the main trunk at about 6 feet from the ground, stout enough to support the weight of a goat. "I lift one leg, you lift one leg. Neville tied the cloth," Mackie said. Mackie and Stephen lifted the hind legs of the goat to the killing branch, each with one hand on an ankle, the other hand supporting the goat's chest. Neville Jarrett twisted the cloth, tying the goat's ankles to the branch. The goat arched its back to hold its head level, 4 legs reaching out to the air in the manner of a praying mantis. When Mackie and Stephen let go, the goat hung calmly. Stephen observed the goat, its calm face, its beard. It behaved as if it were aware of its role in this ritual, a willing participant. Mackie called Stephen close to watch. Neville and Stephen each held a foreleg to control the struggles of the goat when the time would come. Mackie held his arm gently around the goat's head, his hand stroking its chin. He muttered words of reassurance. The words, gentle at first, grew into an incantation. He chanted a string of words in such thick patois that Stephen could not understand them at all. Then the words ended in English that Stephen could understand. "Forgive us in the name of Jah. With this blessing, we change your name from goat to mutton," Mackie said. Finishing these words, Mackie drew the knife across the throat of the goat. Blood spurted bright and forcefully from the neck with each suddenly frantic heartbeat. The severed windpipe convulsing, blowing blood to a spray with each puff, sucking and gurgling sounds. Eyes rolled back into its head. In its final death throes, the goat held its mouth open, tongue curling, moving in grotesque slow movements. Stephen held the foreleg as the goat shook a little, but besides that, he was surprised at how little struggle there had been. The flow of blood ebbed. The blood on the grass steamed. The goat, now called Mutton, hung lifeless. There was just a little blood on Stephen's pant leg. Okay, now here's the picture that goes along with that. So there's the goat hanging in the tree, and here's Stephen, and there's Mackie and Neville Jarrett, and so that would be Altamont Powell, and I guess that would be who was that supposed to be? I forgot. Anyway, and the guy here, that's Preacher Johnson, and that would be Tracy Bass. There we go. Okay. Right. So, Mackie, Joe Vassell. That's this guy's name is Joe Vassell. Okay. Mackie continued his cut up to the vertebra. Then he worked down from the top. He snapped the neck and cut the spinal cord to remove the head from the body. Neville Jarrett took the head by its horns and brought it to the fire. He held the head in the flames and scraped off the singed fur with a knife. Stephen wondered what Neville was doing with the head, but he didn't ask. He helped tie up the second goat. This time Pixley Wilson and Clive Edmonds tied the ankles. Mackie and Stephen supported the weight of the goat and repeated the ritual. Okay, that is the end of chapter 10. Okay, so I'm going to call it a day there. And okay, so they're slaughtering the goats for the party.